Good afternoon, everyone. Sohoraim Tovim. Welcome back to the Beit Midrash. Glad to have y'all here. Glad to be learning together and glad to keep moving on. As a reminder for everybody, we're getting close to the end of this book. So if you have other things you'd like to learn, other suggestions for what we're going to do after this, start brainstorming them, and if I remember when I send an email next week, I'll put something in, and you can start sending me ideas, and we'll vote on it as we get closer to the end. But for today, we're on chapter 15 of God of Becoming and Relationship, and all about tragedy, and as the famous Harold Kushner book is, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. So before we launch into this relatively moderately short chapter, too, it was only, 4 pages, 3.5 pages. Wanted to get any feedback, comments, thoughts, questions that y'all had, anything you were reflecting on, or wanted to initiate the conversation with today. I was counting in my head too, Barbara, don't worry. But I think you're good to go.
Okay. I was a little unhappy in the way that he talks about a bad thing happens and God is affected by it, God absorbs it, God takes it in, God doesn't let you go. I mean, God is there with you. And I think that that's presupposing that he's already convinced us that there is a God who is looking out for him. And I think that there are people, including myself on most days, who are uncomfortable with that assumption. So
uncomfortable with which part of that assumption?
The assumption that there is a God who's out there doing something and absorbing everything. I find that less than comforting. A God who can't do anything is there, with you all the way. That's not what I'm looking for.
So I think the natural response question to that is, what are you looking for?
What am I looking for? I haven't formulated that yet. I just know I'm not satisfied with this illustration.
That's fair. I quote this often. I quote George Harrison somewhat frequently in this context of, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there.
If you don't know where you're going, what's the second part?
Any road will get you there.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
So, if I think on one hand, it's okay to say, I'm not convinced that this doesn't speak to me, this isn't for me. That's fine. Like, eliminating options is okay. I think the question still is, if it's not speaking to you, then what are you looking for? What do you need more? Personally, I do kind of like this approach, but that's me.
It just seemed very thin to me.
Very thin?
Yeah.
Because?
I mean, 4 pages about a topic that is embraces so much of the pain in the world, and pain for human beings, and he somehow devotes 4 pages to it and says, well, God feels bad too. It feels badly. That's
I will. Let me tell one time.
That just left me feeling very, very cold about the whole thing. I don't know if that's anything about related to what Barbara is saying, but There are things in this book that resonated with me, and this certainly did not.
So I hear you. Like I was a little surprised. I would have expected a little more length out of this also. The one thing I will say is he does spend, 5 chapters or 5 pages earlier in the book on how to, from a process perspective, how do we process tragedy, bad things happening as a general concept. And now he's trying to transport that in a Jewish concept. How does that apply? But yes, tragedy is such a natural gateway for people to engage, and to not talk about it at greater length did seem a little surprising. Yes.
So, sorry.
No, I was about to call on you.
So it's interesting because for me, I really like this few pages. And I agree completely with what Barbara said about he assumes that people believe in God. I mean, I accepted that in maybe chapter 2. I mean, it frustrated me at first, but then I realized, okay, well, that's where he's coming from. I'm accepting that. But for me in this chapter, it doesn't really talk about the God in a way that I don't believe in it. It talked about community. It talked about, laughter. It talked about the God in each of us. And that's the God that speaks to me. So I really enjoyed this chapter.
We'll come back to that in a few moments, but good. Esther, I saw you first, and then Lisa.
I kind of agree with what everybody said, although like Barbara, this didn't disappoint me because it was aligned with what I already believe and was affirming in a way to, I guess, the powerlessness of God, and which I relate to the powerlessness of a parent. We have huge impact over our children and grandchildren, but ultimately we are powerless. One of the things that I had a question about, there's a line here that says, God absorbs and is affected by all that happens, by our choices, by the ways that the world proceeds. That's, if anything, the part that I don't quite understand. I don't understand how God has been impacted because it doesn't seem that, nothing has changed. Not that, again, if we're going with God is pretty powerless, then I guess that's okay. But that part just left me a little, how is God really impacted?
How would we know?
So, okay, if I don't come back to that, remind me to come back to that. Lisa, you had something before too.
Yeah, so I'm just jumping to the very end, which isn't really the point of the chapter. I think he gets to this in a later chapter, but I'm always sort of grappling with what Judaism says about what happens after you die, and what happens. Is there an afterlife? Is there not an afterlife? Do we just? I don't know. I in myself, I haven't come to terms with that. So
Well, that's the next chapter. So
right, I know, but at the very end of this chapter, he says that Joel is not ended, that he's a process and the process never ends. And to me, that's just like so vague. So maybe I'll get more in the next chapter, but it doesn't give me like anything to sink my teeth into. Like I can't visualize what that means, that Joel was a process, is a process, will always be a process.
It's a cliffhanger, right? It waits you want to tune into the next episode, so you know.
Okay, so maybe I'll get more in the next chapter.
God willing, you'll get more in the next chapter.
This left me very vague.
I think he did try. I think what he did was trying to segue himself into the next chapter. He's like, "This is a short chapter. Maybe you'll just keep reading and see what I mean." But I hear your point that like it doesn't. He kind of alludes to something, but doesn't actually say it. So you're left kind of wondering what that means. But hopefully it'll pique your curiosity to come back next Thursday and find out. So let's back up for one moment. Yeah. Again, part of the argument here is not, we keep coming back to God is powerless. And I think I want to keep trying to reframe. It's not that God is powerless. It's that God does not have the power that we usually ascribe to God, which is different than powerless. In some level, and he doesn't really talk about it here, but I'd be curious if he's talked about it elsewhere or written about it elsewhere. With Passover starting this week, what we have is what we see as like the typical power of God interceding in human nature, sending plagues against the Egyptians, splitting the Sea of Reeds for the Israelites. I'd be curious to see how Rabbi Artson reads and understands those sections, and how he would interpret those sections. I suspect I've heard him talk about it and just don't remember. But I'd be curious in a process way how we read that, because that doesn't read as a particularly process-oriented story, the Exodus. And I think, generally speaking, I think most of us don't interpret our reality in that way. I don't think we generally see our lives as God kind of moving pieces around to help ensure that the reality is going in a particular direction. So going back to the previous chapter on suffering, God can't sit there and necessarily just pull the cancer out of a patient necessarily. So how do we understand what is suffering is? So he brings up the example of Joel at the beginning of the book, Joel Schickman. Traditional theology goes with the approach more broadly of, if something bad happened to you, you must have done something to deserve it. And God is making this happen because of what you did. I think I've given the example before of somebody I know who got into a really bad car accident. Thankfully, she was okay. But she got into a bad car accident and then came home and was like, one of my mezuzahs wasn't kosher. That must have been why I got into the car accident. We're like, no, because you were driving without your glasses. That may have been a better reason why you got into the car accident, but that's a different story. But that's kind of the traditional theology. It's, the mezuzah is not kosher, so God caused the car accidents because your mezuzah wasn't kosher. Which I'm pretty confident in saying. I don't like to make broad generalizations, but I'm pretty confident that most of you in this Zoom call or watching this on YouTube later probably don't fully subscribe to that theology. So going back to a previous chapter, he says, so fine, if God's not doing that, if God's not inflicting things, then there's usually, what is the causes of it? And he goes back and says, well, sometimes it's the product of our own choices or the product of other choices around us. Either I made choices that caused me to have something bad happen, or somebody else made a choice and I was an unfortunate side effect of someone else's choice. The classic example I use for this often is, somebody who smokes 5 packs of cigarettes a day and gets lung cancer. It's kind of like, well, it's not that God is punishing you for doing something else wrong. That's kind of the natural consequence of a decision that you had made at some point in time. Sometimes there are bad things that happen that are part of a greater scheme, and we just can't, because we're the ones suffering, we can't quite see the benefit of a larger scheme. So again, one of the classic examples I think I've used before is wildfires. Wildfires have an ecological and environmental benefit to them, but because they destroy our houses, our schools, our synagogues, as we saw in Los Angeles back in January, because they create mass human suffering, we see, like, it seems awful to us. But there might be a larger benefit that if we were to look outside of ourselves, we might see a larger benefit beyond it, that it stinks for us, but it might be okay elsewhere. The other typical example I give is 2 people who are up for the same promotion and only one of them gets it. Yes, it stinks for me. It's awful for me that didn't get it, but my friend who got it, it's wonderful for them. And the third is sometimes, because the world is in process, because the world is ever changing, because the world is dynamic, sometimes bad things just happen. Sometimes tornadoes come and be massive and create let me back up. Sometimes storms produce in a particular way that produces tornadoes that wipe out cities. That's not necessarily a punishment on the people who are suffering. It's just that's the process of nature working in itself. Sometimes genes mutate in particular ways, and sometimes those mutations are beneficial and sometimes they're not. That's just kind of the natural order and the natural cost of living in a dynamic world. So those are kind of what I kind of consider the general causes of what's going on. It's not that God is inflicting it, it's just part of the process of living in this world. Barbara, go ahead, and then we'll come back to the current chapter.
Well, in the second page, when he's talking about Kushner's view that the bull isn't going to attack you because you're going to tell the bull, I'm a vegetarian. But when he
I did like that line. That was a good one.
I do too. When you bring up forest fires in California, that makes me think of earthquakes in California. And the last line in that paragraph says, a better response is to resolve that we use God's gift in a worthy way. So in 1933, when an earthquake wiped out Santa Barbara, it brought on all of the earthquake safety codes we have for buildings now. They didn't used to exist. So in that case, we did use God's gift in a better way and use the example of the tornadoes. Well, I just read a news blurb yesterday about a huge tornado in Kansas about 70 years ago, where huge number of people were killed. That wouldn't happen today because of our tornado early warning systems. So sometimes, even without knowing about process theology or Artson's process theology, humans have figured that out, that you can learn something from some disasters. And I appreciate that. And I like the fact that he gave the Kushner example about the bull and the vegetarian.
Yes. That's a good segue back into this chapter now. So I was kind of giving the summary of the previous chapter on the causes of suffering, and now coming back to this. Fine. So, Joel, I don't remember what Joel, I think, passed away a few years before I had started rabbinical school. So I had kind of heard stories from people who knew him, but I did not. and I don't remember what his illness was, but for whatever reason, Joel developed this serious illness. So, we don't say that God caused it. We can say any number of other things that I already explained, that, it was some freak genetic mutation that caused him to develop whatever illness caused his death. So where does God play into this is where he comes into this chapter to say, okay, where does God play into this? God plays into how we respond to those cases. So God is not in the illness. God is in the people who are supporting Joel and his family. God is in people who came to bring food or provide comfort or hang out together or visit the sick, or all these things that we do when people are ill or suffering or struggling. God is in the way that we respond to these situations. And that's kind of what his argument is here, is rather than looking at God as the cause of the suffering, what if we tried to look at God as the reaction when suffering happens? And how do we best respond in those moments when inevitably tragedy is going to strike? Thoughts, comments, reactions? I know I haven't answered your question yet, Esther, but go ahead.
What that makes me think about, and I agree with it. I agree with you 100%. It's in the response. But then it makes me think, is God necessary? What is really the role of God in our lives? Because there are lots of models and lots of learnings that we have from all over, from other people, from religion, from community, that we get that aren't necessarily, from God, to help people, to be true to our community, good literature, good everything, which you could say is all God inspired, which I believe. Everything is God inspired if you believe in God, but this sort of removes the necessity of God to just be a guide, so to speak, or a role model.
I think I see a little bit where you're coming from. I think where I somewhat disagree is, I think on a natural level, I think most people are inclined towards self-preservation and self-interest. And the rabbis are not necessarily, like, the rabbis have the whole concept of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, which, as we've talked about before, I usually define as the selfish inclination. It's the inclination to do what is best for you and you only. But God comes in to to lure us and to pull us away from that, to say, yes, that might be what's best for you, but remember, it's not only just about you. And that there needs to be a balance. In some ways, I think of God as trying to lure us in the balance of the evil inclination and the good inclination, or the selfish inclination and the altruistic inclination. And God tries to lure us to find a balance between the two, to kind of help us navigate those two inclinations. Because you can be too altruistic also, and you can be too selfish also. Those are both distinct possibilities. And where God comes in is to help be the voice to mediate between the two.
You have to believe in God for those things to occur.
Do you have to? Probably not.
I mean, if you're indifferent
I'll put
to,
it this way, could you come to that conclusion and find a way to do it without God? Probably. Will understanding and feeling like you are not alone in the process of doing it, and you are not alone in the wrestling, and that there's somebody that there is a higher being that is helping you do that, probably supports you and helps you do it easier.
sure, but suppose you're just indifferent to God.
How do I know that's not my mother, my doctor, my husband, my kids telling me to do something different that's better for me?
Yeah.
How about just your logic and your innate goodness? And I mean, Judaism helps us do that. And we absolutely, I mean, I feel very strongly about this, and I believe in goodness. I just don't believe in this God character. So I can just vouch for the fact that you don't need God to, I think that it may be when you're younger and you're more, you're less mature, you may need something like, oh, I'm going to get punished if I do this, so I can't do it. But you should grow out of that and be doing it because it's the right thing to do.
So I'll say yes and to a couple of these. Can your friend, your mother, your husband be that voice to tell you to do what's the right thing for you? Of course. That's part of the responsibility of being in relationship. And that doesn't mean God's not doing it also, or that God's not influencing that also. You still have a choice of whether or not you're going to listen to them. And in some level, sometimes, people suggest things to you not out of your concern, but out of their concern. So, you still have to balance that as part of when you're getting advice from other people generally. As we're having this conversation, I'm kind of thinking to myself, can you do this yourself and say it's not God and it's really your logic and your reason and your brain kind of guiding you on what the right thing to do is. And I'm like, well, yeah, you can say it's your logic, and I'm saying it's God, and we're kind of saying the same thing, aren't we?
Yes.
So, you can say it's not really God. I'll say, well, that's exactly what God is doing. And, it comes to somewhat of an impasse at that point.
Right.
Is that, we're kind of saying the same thing and just calling it by a different title.
Right.
And in some sense, you could look at your mother, your husband, your friend who's telling you what to do, in some sense as the malach, the angel that God is sending to help you get yourself on the right path also. Karen.
Yeah, wait a minute. I had it and it just went out. Yeah, like for me, I can definitely, maybe I can't anymore, but I admit, maybe I can definitely go with why do we, I can definitely be in the discussion like why do we need God? Maybe. But I think I swing more to it, is
You're breaking up a
God,
little
there
bit,
is
Karen, so it's
a
hard to hear.
mystery, but oh, can you hear me now?
Now
Yeah.
you're
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Not
good.
the, I guess I'm saying that it's just easier for me. It's easier for me if it's not just me. It's easier for me if there's a greater like energy through communities, through knowing selfish, like being generous, doing the right thing. There's something about, even if it's groups of people doing that and having that love energy. I mean, I think there's something to that. The more I question this question, because we've been
I think we lost you, Karen. But um,
Thanks.
I think we lost you in there somewhere. But Christine, was that a hand up or were you just adjusting? Yes, go ahead.
Maybe this is a little belated, but this is kind of where the conversation had started, with regard to tragedy not necessarily being manufactured by God, but our response to it, maybe him guiding us toward our better selves. And I'm thinking quite personally of a dear friend. Our next door neighbors, when I was a child, had 3 daughters, and the youngest daughter was my age. And when we were 5, their father died of a heart attack at age 39. And yes, it was a tragedy, and it was hard for all of them. And after he died, his wife, who was very much the traditional stay-at-home mom who had never learned how to drive, became a pillar of the community. And she learned how to drive, and she was deeply involved in her church. And I think that was where the community really helped her through her grief. And also she became a channel for wonderful things in her church because of it. So much so that when she retired and moved back to her native Michigan, the entire town held a party for her. And I'm not saying that George dying at 39 was a blessing. It wasn't. But so many of these things that allowed her to be an independent woman, that forced her to be an independent woman, who, she never remarried. She's now living in a nursing home in her 90s. She became something that her community probably would have never seen her become without it. And do I think that's because God killed off her husband? No. I think it's because God helped her get through the grief of losing her husband with the community around her.
That's a beautiful example. Thank you. One of the things Rabbi Artson says that like the second to last paragraph at the bottom of 132 is that I saw God being very busy throughout Joel's struggle, in moments of laughter and song, and the strength of the relating that bound us all as a community and kept Joel feeling connected through his very last minutes, and the determination to be there with and for his family throughout and beyond the ordeal. That some of it is God is not just balancing our evil and good inclination, which I said before, but God's also in the connection between us, in what is connecting us together as people.
I'm thinking of our dearly departed Paul Miller, who was in our Torah study class back at Temple Emmanuel, who used to say, I'd like to get God out of the wind business, the wind and destruction business. That's not his job. His job is after that.
Well, not only after that, I think particularly after that, but also in the God is in the moments of connection and relationship between us. So God is found in the way that we connect and relate and build that strength of relationship between people at any moment. But what is most necessary during times of struggle and suffering and tragedy. Um, and I think that's an important way to think of it also, is that God is not necessarily, God is part of luring us to the right choice, but the choice that God is luring us towards is towards greater connection with each other, which is what we're striving for along the way. I do want to come back to Esther's question that she asked however many minutes ago at this point. I didn't track when you actually asked it, but in the last paragraph, Rabbi Artson talks about God being the ultimate exemplar of process, and God absorbs and is affected by all that happens, by all our choices, by the ways that the world proceeds. And when tragedy strikes, our sorrows are not lost. They permanently become part of the divine. So there's a couple of ways to kind of conceptualize and think about this. On one scale, I'll start with this one. I'll start with my 1 to 2 minute version of Kabbalah, of the principle of Kabbalah. What you do in this world, the basic principle of Kabbalah is what happens in this world, what you do in this world has an effect on the divine world. And what has an effect on the divine world has an effect on this world. So in the basic Kabbalistic concept, if you think the basic Kabbalistic concept, the world is supported and survives by a divine energy that God flows into this world. When we do good things, when we do mitzvot, when we build greater connection, when we build greater justice, in a sense, it opens the system for more divine energy to flow into this world. When we transgress, when we do something wrong, when we sin, then it stops up the faucet, so to speak, from the divine energy flowing as strongly into this world. And so what we do here affects what God does in the above world. In some sense, I don't think Rabbi Artson is talking about the flow of divine energy as much, but what he is talking about is when things happen, when things happen in this world, God is affected by what happens. God feels it also. There is, I can't remember who taught it. There is a sense, there's a rabbi who teaches that God and Israel are twins in a sense. And if you've heard these stories of identical twins where they can be on opposite sides of the country, and one of them will get hurt, the other one will feel it without knowing that their twin got hurt. When something bad happens, God feels it. God notices it. God absorbs that also. Now, how does that play out practically? Not super clear, frankly. I think part of the way it plays out is everything that happens leads to the next choice that you have to make. So what what the next choice that God is going to try to guide you to is based on what happened immediately before that. And so, again, in some way, the practical choice is what is the next choice that you have to make that God's going to try to guide you to make the right choice about. But on a broader sense, it's nice to know we're not alone in our suffering when we are. And it's somewhat comforting to know that when tragedy strikes, when bad things happen to us, whether it's just us or whether it's family, we're not alone in that. I know I've shared it before, but one of my favorite images it comes from the Eish Kodesh, Rabbi Kalanimus Kalman Shapira of Piasetzner, who continued teaching in the Warsaw Ghetto, and has this beautiful analogy and teaching about where is God while the Holocaust is going on. And he says God has kind of retreated into the innermost parts of the palace and is crying about all the suffering that's going on at that moment. That God is in tears, bawling about what's going on. But he goes on, which is in and of itself, it's a beautiful analogy of, God just feeling like I can't stop this, but it hurts so much. But he goes on and says, a person feels the same way. Like a person feels like they can't handle this anymore. And how am I supposed to go on? But when they study Torah, when they pray, when they do a mitzvah, then they're able to kind of sit in the room with God and know that when I'm crying, I'm not crying alone, that God is crying with me. And there's, I do feel there's some comfort in knowing that when I'm crying, God is crying along with me at that moment. Yes, Esther.
So, I'm thinking to myself, and we've talked about this before, that God must be very confused, crying and laughing and having joy and having sorrow at the same time. Because there's, and I think about, we have some very religious people in our government who think they're doing, God's word and what's absolutely right and God inspired and God. And, I'm crying. And my perception of God is that he must be, crying, and if he has hair, tearing it out. So it's confusing to me when we, on the one hand, sort of anthropomorphize God, and humanize him in terms of his ability to feel, to comfort, to be powerless, as we all are to a certain extent, and yet to think of him or her or it as some greater being. I'm going to add just one more thing. I've been going through a lot of boxes in my house and finding things that I wrote really as a young child. And I see that my concept of God has not changed. I never thought of him as some human figure, but always as some spirit that was in everything. So it's kind of interesting to me to look back and go, some things just never change. We are who we are, who we are. Anyways.
That's interesting. As you were talking in the first part, I was kind of thinking the opposite of what you were saying, is that, we're anthropomorphizing God. But on the flip side, we're supposed to be created in God's image. So in some sense, we're just miniature, imperfect versions of God above of God around us. And yeah, there are moments where we feel very confused emotionally, where like we are, we might have lost a loved one and be crying in grief, and then a memory will pop into our minds that will make us laugh in the middle of it. Or somebody will say something that will trigger some other thought along the way, that will completely change our emotional state. We get confused that way also. And I think, going to your political example, yes, I think it's very easy to say this is what God wants. And I know we've wrestled with this question a few times throughout the book, and I think the best way to think about it is, God wants us to create a world that is increasing in justice, is increasing in compassion, is increasing in connection. That's what God ultimately is asking for. So if we are making decisions that based on God's word that are not doing any of those three things, or even not doing all of those three things, then you have to really question whether that's really what God wants. God does not want you seeking power. God wants you seeking connection. Yes, Lisa.
So I may have a question about God being, whether or not God is all knowing. Because he says here that everything that's happened, the sorrow, God knows and remembers all that, and the joy, God knows and remembers all that. So basically, he is saying that God is all knowing about everything that has happened. Like God carries all of that with God, but God is not all knowing about the future. Is that correct to say?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate. I think the one tweak I might make is God is never forgetting, but not all knowing. All knowing.
What's the difference about the past?
I think in terms of the past, not much. I think saying that God knows everything that has happened and hasn't forgotten any of it. It's just, yes, it's the future that God is unaware of.
So somehow God has this capacity, because there's going to be, as we go on in time, there's more and more and more in the past. So God has this capacity to increase, to encapsulate everything that has ever happened.
Yes. Because in a sense, everything that has ever happened has affected the world to be where it is now. If we are taking seriously the idea that everything is interrelated and interwoven, then the famous butterfly effect really does play out in some pretty major ways. Somebody made a decision 50,000 years ago that in some ways may have affected the reality to where we are today. Or even more, with the archaeology, might affect our understanding of what the future is, who people were, and affects our understanding of reality at this moment. That in the sense, if God is kind of is this kind of at the source of everything, it is part of interwoven into all of reality, then everything that's ever happened has helped us get to this very moment the way it is. And so God is aware of all of it. Yes, Christine.
May I ask a question? And I hesitate to open this can of worms 4 minutes before we're about to end. But if God doesn't know the future, then how would that explain, how would you answer the translation of God's name being, I will be what I will be?
I think Rabbi Artson looks at it as that's like the ultimate statement of process. I will be whatever I will be. Like I'll become whatever I end up becoming, but that's going to be part of the process of becoming along the way also. That we're all going to be what we will eventually be. It's just a question of what that's going to look like.
Well, and isn't the whole concept of God knowing or not knowing the future one of the great questions of all of the religions? I mean, the Presbyterians think that he knows everything that's going to happen, right?
Yes.
When you talk about predestination, but that doesn't cancel out free will, or does it? I mean, do any of us really have that answer, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I mean, Rabbi Artson makes the argument that if God knows what's going to happen, then there can't really be free will because God already knows the choice we're going to make. So that's kind of where he comes down to this process question is, if God truly is omniscient, then God knows everything that is, was, and ever will be.
Mm-hmm.
But in that case, that's, in some sense, we're just going through the motions of this life, which I guess is fine, but, doesn't feel very meaningful, and for me at least, to say, like, God already knows what I'm going to do, so it doesn't really matter what I do because I'm going to do whatever God's going to make me do one way or the other because God already knows the answer.
Exactly.
So, any closing thoughts, comments, questions before we wrap up?
I just want to say that I'm very reluctant to say to anyone, Margaret, mother, husband, whatever, who tells me something to do, that they are speaking to me with the words of God. I just can't bring myself to say that.
But perhaps it's the fact that they're coming to you to connect and build the relationship that is where God is found also.
Rabbi, I know you could bring God into any conversation, couldn't you?
That's the job.
I have been known when people walk in, like if I'm teaching and somebody walks in and goes, "Oh, sorry, I'm late." Like, sorry, yeah, you got here when God wanted you to be here. It's fine.
That's sweet.
So, kol hakavod, everyone. Thank you for the conversation and for the discussion. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and particularly a Chag Sameach. I hope your Seder celebrations and your Pesach celebrations are meaningful and help build connection with all those you're trying to connect with. And we'll be back. Yep, Thursday's Chol HaMoed. We can totally do class next week. So we will plan to do class next week. And as Lisa hinted at before, we'll be talking about what happens. We've covered tragedy, but what happens when after this life ends and what happens beyond. That'll be the source for next week.
I'd like to share one thing that came up in a Women's League meeting yesterday. The executive director, Rabbi Ellen Mullins Fields, wished us all a Chag Kasher V'Sameach and reminded us that we shouldn't get so hung up on the kosher part that we miss the Sameach part. And I just thought that was so wise. So
Amen.
As you
Okay.
said, everybody have a sweet Passover.
Shabbat
Excellent.
Shalom and Chag Sameach, everyone.
Chag Sameach.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Rabbi.
you.